right, today will be our review of a Sunday school lesson from Joshua chapter 3 and Joshua chapter 4. The crossing of the Jordan River. It's something that we have been studying and working our way towards for seemingly several months, which actually I suppose it's probably only been maybe a month as we've slowly transitioned from the book of Numbers to the book of Joshua. But we see here in chapter 3 the preparing of the crossing, and then we cross in chapter 3, and in chapter 4 we talk about a memorial that we'll get to here in just a moment. But as a reminder, the things that we have been studying from the last chapter of Leviticus and the few chapters that we read in Deuteronomy, and then the first two chapters in Joshua basically have taken place over the course of just a short amount of time, perhaps a month. And I'm not 100% sure on that, but the thing I'm trying to get through is that the events that we've been studying from the last part of Leviticus with Moses' death and whatnot has really not taken much time in the narrative of Scripture. It's just been a short time. Perhaps the Hebrews have been camping in the plains of Moab for about a year. So they're camping on the east side of the Jordan River, about 10 miles roughly from Jericho. And as we saw in chapter 2, Rahab and those that lived in Jericho knew that God's people were living across the Jordan. And we see here the faith of Rahab in chapter 2, verse 10, and how she admits to the realization that Israel, that the Hebrews are going to take the land. And so, but I'm saying all that to say that them camping east of Jericho and the movement to cross the Jordan after the death of Moses has only been a very, very short time, and again, perhaps a month. And so here in chapter 3, Joshua tells the camp to prepare themselves, to get ready, to cross the Jordan. We see here in chapter 3, verse 5, Joshua says, to sanctify yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua knows that it's going to take a miracle of God in order to cross the Jordan. We have 2 or 3 million people. They're going to have to cross. And the only way that that's going to happen is if God intervenes, which we see here in verse 7. God tells Joshua that in verse 7 it says, this day will I begin to magnify thee in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So Joshua knows that God is going to work in some type of supernatural way for all of these many millions of people to cross this river. At this particular time, the river is flooded, it's swollen, it's perhaps 2 miles wide and maybe 100 foot deep. And normally Jordan is not a very big river. It's not very wide. It's not very deep. But in the months of the spring rains, it does flood, and then the plains will fill with water. And so at the time, as we see later in chapter 4, they cross in the springtime in perhaps late April, or late March or early April, and the river is flooded. And so we see here that Moses, Joshua commands the priest to bear the ark, and essentially the priests are going to carry the ark about a half mile in front of the crowd. The crowd will follow the ark, and we see here in verse 15 or so that the priests go down to the river and their feet get wet. So the only way that the river will part and dry up is for the priests to actually put their feet in the water, which took great faith, because here you have this raging torrent of river flowing past, and you know that the only way that this crowd of people behind you can cross is for a supernatural occurrence to happen. And we see that when they put their feet in the water in verse 15, which showed a great amount of faith, that we see in verse 16 that God backed up the waters, and so that the waters going downstream continued to flow to the Dead Sea, and the waters that were coming from upstream backed up some 20 miles to the city of what is Adam, is what verse 16 says, which is some 20 miles north of where they happen to be crossing. And we see here that the waters backed up, the tributaries and the rivers feeding into it all backed up some 20 miles, and that it says there in verse 17 of chapter 3 that the people passed over on dry ground. So not only was it the miracle that God held the water back, but that he also dried the ground so that the folks could pass over. Going on to chapter 4, Joshua had 12 men appointed, one from each tribe. They were commanded to take a stone from the riverbed to build a memorial on the west side of Jordan in Gilgal, we'll find later. And so they built a memorial as a reminder to them and to their children about what the miracle that God did here in crossing the dry riverbed of the Jordan River. We see here in verse 6, it says that it may be a sign unto you, and that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean ye these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it passed over Jordan. And so this memorial, made of 12 stones from the riverbed, was built in Gilgal on the west side of the Jordan River. We see in verse 9 that Joshua, after they built this altar, or they gathered their stones for this memorial, Joshua goes back into the riverbed, and he actually, on his own, builds an altar out of 12, or a memorial out of 12 stones from the riverbed at the spot where they crossed. And so here the priests are still standing in the water. Everyone has crossed. All of these stones have been gathered. Joshua goes back into the riverbed, collects 12 stones on his own, and builds a memorial in the riverbed itself. And then we see here that that after that's all done, then the priests come walking out, and it says there, verse 18 of chapter 4, And it came to pass, when the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord were come up out of the midst of Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry land, that the waters of Jordan returned to their place and flowed over all its banks as it did before. And that's referencing what we read in chapter 3, verse 15. And so once everyone was passed over, passed over Jordan, then the priests came out and the water returned. In chapter 4, verse 19, this says, and it came to pass, and the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. So they're just a few miles away from Jericho. But the significance of the 10th day of the first month, that is when the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 was instituted. God had commanded Moses and the Hebrews to select their lamb for the Passover on the first day, or the 10th day of the first month. And so, wouldn't you know it, some 40 years exactly to the date that God had instituted the beginnings of the Passover was when the Hebrews crossed the Jordan River into Canaan, and symbolically taking over their promised land. Something to think about is the fact that God knew all along when this would all take place, and I don't think it's any coincidence. I think that this is an act of God that they crossed Jordan 40 years to the day that he instituted the Passover. And again, you can read about that in Exodus chapter 12, specifically verses 12 and 13. So we see here, to wrap up this review, we've crossed the Jordan River. Finally, we are camping on the western side of the Jordan River at Gilgal, just a few miles away from Jericho. And as the upcoming chapters will cover, the victory at Jericho and the desolation of Jericho. There's probably a whole lot more we could have talked about in this lesson, but hopefully that gives you an overview of some of the things that we spoke of in Sunday school November 1st. Thank you.